Hello, folks. Today I'm here to talk to you about the TV show that never was, Bruce Wayne. But before we begin, let's go back a little bit to explain what Bruce Wayne was going to be. Back in the late 1990s, DC was struggling to pick up the pieces of the much malaligned and disgusted Batman and Robin. Meanwhile, Marvel, on the other hand, was rising to prominence with Blade and the X-Men. With all that in mind, DC wanted to bring Batman back into the night with a vengeance. But while Christopher Nolan would eventually bring Batman back in 2005 with Batman Begins, what most people do not know is that we might have had him brought back sooner, only on the small screen. In 1999, scriptwriter Tim McInnerly wrote a 62-page pilot script for a TV show revolving around a teenage Bruce Wayne, to show the how and why origins of Batman, though it's not as if we don't know that through the flashbacks. The show would have been made in the early 2000s, but unfortunately, a myriad of production issues ultimately resulted in it being scrapped. However, there was a pilot script that was leaked online eventually, and the pilot was as follows. Alfred bails a soon-to-be 18-year-old Bruce Wayne from a London police station after Bruce has gotten himself into yet another fight. Alfred informs Bruce that the trustees of his family's company need to see him, and though he'd rather stay where he is, Bruce nods when Alfred just tells him he has no choice. After having a nightmare about his parents' murder, Bruce wakes up in his private jet and turns the TV to see every show talking about him, including one hosted by Vicky Vale. Meanwhile, Alfred reads a book about troubled teens. Arriving in Gotham City, Bruce ponders why anyone would want to live in a city like this, as he points out that running his company does not seem part of the plan. After being mobbed by reporters, the two finally arrive at Wayne Manor, where after snapping at Alfred for bothering him because he got emotional from seeing his family portrait, Bruce heads out with Alfred at his side, driving the Rolls Royce. They arrive at the area where Bruce's parents were killed, now known as Crime Alley. Bruce visits the very place where his parents were killed, where he opens up to Alfred, saying that it was his fault all because he had to see Zorro, described by him as a silly movie about a hero who wears a costume and fights crime. Suddenly, thugs appear, and despite Alfred's pleas, Bruce fights the thugs. Using martial arts that he's learned, Bruce fights, disarms, and defeats the thugs. Bruce and Alfred then drop the thugs off at GCPD, but their report is almost ignored until Bruce is recognized by a 13-year-old fan, Barbara Gordon. The two have a conversation, and Barbara introduces her father, someone Bruce has already known from when he was 6, Detective James Gordon. Ignoring the board with notes and arrows pointing towards Wayne Corp, he asks Gordon who killed his parents. Gordon shows Bruce the file on his parents, which is now a cold case because the killer was never caught. When asked about the thugs or even his family's company, all Bruce says is he's leaving soon because he wants nothing to do with Gotham City. As Bruce leaves, Gordon asks about Charles Palantine, whom he's meeting the next day. While he nods, he notices if Gordon's words are a warning. Meeting Palantine the next day, Bruce asks about the investigation, and Palantine notes the police commissioner is a close personal friend. As Bruce is about to sign, because of the sight of Alfred and another old friend called Lucius Fox, he explains that he will look over the papers at his home. Now an intern, Fox reveals his father's accidental death, while Palantine reminds Bruce that he needs the papers signed first thing in the morning, for his 18th birthday is only 2 days away. Knowing the danger Bruce is now in, Alfred suggests a lawyer, and Bruce thinks of another old friend, Harvey Dent. Right in the middle of a costume party, Harvey welcomes Bruce back and says he will look at the papers. Bruce decides to stay at the party even though he hates costumes, but he spots a stunning woman in a tiger costume, Selina Kyle. Bruce is pulled away from Harvey, who wants him to meet his sister. While waiting, Bruce talks to an attractive girl wearing an angel costume. When Selina and Harvey come into the room, Bruce learns that the angel is Susan, Harvey's sister. Because Selina says she is saving Bruce from where he is, Susan leaves. Bruce becomes angry at Selina, so she leaves too. Before he can do anything, Bruce is informed by Alfred that Gordon called for him at Wayne Chemical. Arriving there and noticing the green pool of hazardous chemicals, Gordon and Bruce learn that neither one called the other. It's a trap! The access hatch closes, then locks, and water rushes into the room. Working together, Gordon and Bruce find a tunnel 20 feet overhead, and using acrobatics, Bruce gets himself and Gordon to safety. Both agree that someone wants them dead. Nearby, Palantine watches. The next morning, Bruce and Gordon meet with Fox and his mother, talking about his late father, whom they describe as nervous just before he died. Fox says he will check around. Bruce meets with Harvey, who demands that he does not sign the papers. While this happens, Harvey gets 2 phone calls, from his mother and his father, with him playing both sides. All of a sudden, Harvey's mood swings and he tells Bruce to sign the papers. Bruce changes the subject and asks about Susan, and Harvey tells him the location of where she works. As they leave, two sedans come up behind the rolls and open fire. The chase begins and ends where Susan works, the Gotham City Youth Shelter. Meeting Susan, Bruce apologizes and asks for a date, successfully getting back on her good side. Back at Wayne Manor, Bruce creates a ruse to explain why he did not turn in the papers just yet. Just then, Gordon calls and tells him what Fox has found. Weekly shipments of hazardous waste. Bruce wants to meet, but Gordon tells Bruce to stay. Bruce gets an idea, alarming Alfred. Later, Bruce arrives at Wayne Chemical, dressed in all black, and follows Gordon, Rupert Montoya, and Harvey Bullock. Suddenly, the three encounter more thugs. Bruce helps, but stays out of sight the whole time. After defeating them all, with a banana peel no less, he and Alfred leave, with Bruce commenting that he may have found something he's good at. Bruce and Alfred meet with Gordon, learning that the chemicals were drugs, and later hear that one of the thugs hung himself while in prison. Later, Bruce is greeted by a surprise birthday party with Harvey, Susan, Selena, and Lucius Fox, along with Jim and Barbara Gordon, Bullock, and Montoya. It's midnight, and Bruce is now 18 years old. Harvey destroys the papers Bruce was told to sign, as he now owns Wayne Corp. Palantine comes to the party and tells Bruce that their stocks might take a beating if word gets out about the drugs. He then gives Bruce a book, Business for Beginners, and after he leaves, Bruce tells everyone he has a lot to learn and that he's staying in Gotham. Overall, I think this is a very interesting pilot, and had it been fleshed out, some of the following events would have been. Bruce would think that his family's company might not only be responsible for the decline of Gotham City and the corruption within it, but they may also be trying to kill him. A story arc would have been centered on crooked businessmen trying to take over Wayne Enterprises, and Bruce coming into conflict with the local mafia, led by Rupert Thorne and Carmine Falcone, later to be taken over by Oswald Cobblepot. Bruce's ally is Detective Gordon, who has his own enemies in the GCPD, led by Lieutenant Blass. Gordon's story arc would have revolved around his struggles with police corruption. Harvey Dent is Bruce Wayne's best friend, a few years older than him, selfish, spoiled, rich, and shameless. Harvey's friendship with Bruce might lead him to take a different route later in life. Had the show been greenlit, Harvey's story would have been fleshed out. His abusive father, troubled childhood, struggles with law school, and subtle hints as to his development into Two-Face. Despite the character of Susan Dent in the pilot, Bruce would have had a number of romantic interests in the first season, including Barbara Gordon, who really should have been younger and not a romantic interest, young TV gossip reporter Vicky Vale, and a psychology student named Harleen Quinzel. These three would play an important role in Bruce's future. A few characters from the Batman mythos would have also made appearances in certain episodes or the entire show. Examples of these include a mysterious consultant in Selena Kyle, a would-be comedian, described as Sam Kinison, but angrier, named Jack Napier, a psychology professor named Jonathan Crane, and a disturbed con man named Edward Nigma. As the series progressed, Bruce would have become more and more fascinated by the criminal element, spending time in Arkham Asylum, restoring Wayne Manor, and bringing in a series of martial arts trainers. He would become more of a night owl, as he notes he enjoys riding his motorcycle with leather and a helmet, which makes him anonymous. It was planned towards the end of the first season that Bruce and Alfred would find a cavern underneath Wayne Manor, which would become the future Batcave. This was incorporated into the TV series Gotham. In later season, it was planned for Bruce to take bigger steps, such as joining the GCPD, to be with Gordon, and even the FBI, but these do not last, the reason being Bruce can't work within the system. While primarily set in Gotham, Bruce would have traveled abroad to China, Korea, France, and other parts of the world to learn defense attacks, criminology, detective skills, and manhunting. He would train with heroes such as Ted Grant and Richard Dragon, and villains like Slade Wilson and Ra's al Ghul, the latter of which was incorporated into Batman Begins. Bruce's skills would increase as the series progressed, affecting his martial arts, car racing, helicopter and airplane flying, gymnastics, and much more. While the world thinks he's a rich kid living it up, it's actually working towards a bigger purpose. Once Bruce gains control of Wayne Corp, he uses the company resources to help him with his cause. This includes R&D in special weapons, prototypes, and vehicles that all disappear and end up as part of Batman's arsenal. This is mirrored in the later film Batman Begins. Wayne Corp would win a bid to build the FBI's computer criminal database, to which Bruce would have access. Although it is unknown if the scene was to be filmed in the study with a crashing bat like the classic comics, the series finale would have been about Bruce figuring out the best way to stop the criminal element in Gotham City by becoming a bat. One thing I want to point out about the idea of Barbara Gordon being a 13-year-old fan is that, as a romantic love interest, this would not have worked out in the long run of the show. Bruce was already 18 years old, so while it is most likely that any potential romance with Barbara Gordon would have amounted to a one-sided schoolgirl crush on Barbara's side, Barbara's age creates a bit of a problem with how I feel the show would have handled Dick Grayson later down the line. I always thought that Dick Grayson was approximately a early teenager by the time he met Bruce Wayne at the latest, like being 12, 13 years old when he was taken in by Bruce. And Bruce himself was probably closer to being in his mid to late 20s. So having Barbara Gordon, and by extension, if he was to appear in the show, Dick Grayson, already be teenagers when Bruce Wayne was himself 17 to 18 years old, means that there isn't really a whole lot of time to introduce Dick Grayson in a way that could set him up to become Robin later, as by the time it would make the most sense for Bruce to end up having a Robin, Dick would already be about 18 years old, which is about the age he was in Batman Forever, and that really doesn't fit the dynamic of him adopting Dick as his ward and later son. Instead, he feels more like a younger brother type of character, and I just don't think that works for Batman and Robin as a whole. Later in life, perhaps, but I really feel that Batman should be a young man closer to his 30s, while Dick Grayson is a teenager by the time he becomes Robin, rather than almost a young adult, as the show would imply to happen. Sounds like a great series, right? Well, sadly, it was the popularity and profitability of Batman that led to this show's cancellation, as the executives at Warner Bros. At the time didn't want a live-action series competing with multiple attempts at rebooting the film franchise, so the series was shelved. It's a shame too, as it would have been nice to see a pre-Batman Gotham. While this would eventually come to pass with Gotham in 2014, the overall concept of this incarnation was much different than what Gotham would come to show us. As for Bruce Wayne, what would become of it? Look to the sky, for it was not a bird or a plane that took flight, but a young Superman series by the name of Smallville. And much like the idea for Bruce Wayne, the producers of this show wanted to strip Superman to his bare essence, exploring why Clark Kent became the Man of Steel, which it did over the course of 10 seasons. But even this was not the end for Bruce Wayne. In fact, Clark Kent was initially going to appear in Bruce Wayne as well. All that is known is that Bruce would have met Clark after he came to town for a Wayne Corp-sponsored conference of high school journalists. Bruce would dismiss Clark at first as a nice kid from the sticks, before realizing there was something odd about this farm boy. After the success of Smallville, attempts and pitches were made by Go and Miller, the producers of Smallville, to do Bruce Wayne as a companion show. Their attempts were denied, as well as any attempt to bring Bruce Wayne into Smallville as a guest star. These failed due to a bat embargo, essentially meaning Batman or any other related media was not to appear in anything other than his few animated appearances at the time, which also impacted the productions of said series. As well, the production of Batman Begins showcased the origins that Bruce Wayne was planning to show as well. This served as the final nail in the coffin for Bruce Wayne. It was dead. Instead, there were many analogs and Easter eggs that alluded to the Dark Knight over the course of the show, as well as bringing in Green Arrow to serve as Clark's billionaire best friend. Therefore, the world's finest never appeared together on Smallville. The closest we ever get to seeing Bruce in Smallville is the Season 11 comic of said show, though the biggest reference to him was in Season 10, where series original character Chloe mentions having met a billionaire with high-tech toys. This, along with Wonder Woman, never appearing in Smallville, meant that the Trinity would not appear together until the maligned Dawn of Justice in 2016. But what do you think? Do you think this show would have made for an interesting series? Whatever your thoughts, comment below, and if you want to see more, catch you on the flip side.